Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. On today's show, Dr. Joel Myers and I share the untold story behind the invasion of Normandy on that fateful date in 1944 and reveal how weather played a major role. Plus, it's one of the questions we answer in our segment, What If? How did Allied forces ensure victory on D-Day? What if the long-planned mission had been postponed? And we take an interesting look at the differences and similarities in the forecasting tools we used during World War II to the ones we use today. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg. Two years of planning, an army of Allied troops. But what the masterminds of this massive operation, otherwise known as D-Day, couldn't control was the weather. How did planners change course to achieve one of the greatest military victories of all time? It's one of the fascinating stories in the book, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. Joining me to help us delve deeper into the invasion of Normandy is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. This is a fascinating story. I mean, really, you can make the argument this is one of the most important weather forecasts in history, right?
Certainly up to that time it was. You had 5,000 ships crossing the English Channel. You had thousands of planes involved. You had a million troops involved, ultimately supporting and involved. And the element of surprise was so important because the Germans obviously controlled the continent, were well entrenched, had all the defensive barriers because they were expecting an invasion to come and they wanted to repel it. And if they had, then the Allies would have been set back. So you have to think of the time. So it's 2.5 years after Pearl Harbor, after the war, the United States entered the war, and they've been planning this operation, as you said, for almost 2 years. And when was it going to happen? The weather was stormy in that area, and if the weather wasn't cooperative, it could have been a disaster. If, on the other hand, the Germans knew the timing, it would have been a disaster. As it was, thousands of troops on the Allied side were lost that first day.
Why was the weather so important for the success of D-Day?
The weather tends to be stormy. I mean, waves, they needed just right conditions. The weather coming in from the Atlantic Ocean tends to move from west to east.
Right.
A lot of uncertainty, and the Germans didn't have many observations over there because they didn't have any from Britain or the Atlantic because the United States controlled the Atlantic Ocean. So we had the advantage of how the weather was moving, but it's still very uncertain and tended to be stormy. You had to pick just the right period, ideally with some moonlit skies, with low tide. You had to come in at low tide, and you couldn't have the waves as it was. A lot of the men were seasick anyway as they were coming ashore. But they had to be very coordinated because they had all these guns pointed down, shooting as they came. All the Germans were entrenched. They had to go up, hit the beach, and then go up the hill. But they did take the Germans by surprise.
There were some certain different techniques between the two different groups of meteorologists that were making the forecast, and they knew the importance of it, so they were well-staffed.
There are three different groups: the Royal Navy, the UK Meteorological Agency, and the US Air Force. The UK meteorologists had more experience with the weather in that area.
Because the weather moves in a certain direction from west to east,
generally,
that gave the Allies an advantage over the Germans.
Explain. It did, because we controlled and had the observations to the west, although over the ocean, particularly the eastern part of an ocean, it's more complicated, obviously, than over land to track storms. You don't have many observations, and particularly in that area.
When you were a Penn State professor, when you were teaching forecasting, you kind of ran across the same kind of, when you were scoring your students, when you had a forecasting contest, you noticed that the consensus forecasts tend to be better.
Well, up to that point, nobody used that. Well, I had a class of 40 students generally, And they'd each have to make a forecast the next day, 2, 3 ahead, different parameters, temperature and humidity, and a variety of parameters. And they each got scored according to a particular score that they knew. And at the end of the semester, the best student might have 300 errors, and the worst might have 1,400. Now, if anybody beat me, they got an automatic A. And I had.
Did anybody ever beat you?
Yeah, probably over 21 years.
Okay.
17 or 18 people
Okay.
beat me. And they got an automatic A, and a number of them got hired here to work at AccuWeather. But I found that the average of these parameters on of the 9th and 10th rated student out of a class of 40 would beat the #1 forecaster. So I said, aha, so let me hire the very best students, put them together at AccuWeather, and have them work in a consensus collaborative way, and we'll produce a more accurate forecast than anybody else. And over time, we've integrated the computer model output into that. And we found, too, that let's not take a straight average either. We can do better by some forecasters have shown greater skill for certain things, snow prediction, this and that, weight them heavier, and also have them discuss it out. If people can convince others that they're right, that's even going to be better. So it's gotten more complicated, but that's part of the AccuWeather philosophy of how we produce more accurate forecasts.
Thanks, Dr. Myers. We'll catch up with you in just a few minutes as we take a different look at D-Day in our latest edition of What If. But joining us right now is Dr. Rob Citino. He's a senior historian at the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. Dr. Citino, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a treat, Bernie. Great.
All right, so why was the D-Day invasion so important?
By June of 1944, the war had been raging for 5 long years in Europe. It was time to bring it to an end. The casualties were not getting smaller. The violence was not ratcheting down. It was ratcheting up. The insertion of a large Western Allied force in Europe would put the Germans in a vice. That is, facing the Soviet Union in the east and those armies coming in, and now the Americans and their allies from the west. It would present Germany with a two-front war, and that was always the German military nightmare. Quickest way to end the war.
And what steps did the U.S. and its allies make to keep D-Day plans hidden? Any false operations to throw the Germans off track?
There's really a pretty marvelous deception operation the Allies pull off. Operation Fortitude, for the record. They create a fake army group, inflated tanks, fake messages, fake encampments. So if any German aircraft get over there, they might think, well, wait a minute. This is a big Allied force in northern Britain. That means they're going to land not in Normandy, but to the north of the famous district known as the Pas-de-Calais.
What was the German response to the invasion?
What's interesting, the Germans didn't think the Allies were going to land where they landed, Normandy. It seemed to the Germans that it was a bit far away from Germany, that it was not really landing a direct blow. They said to themselves, where would we land if we were doing this? And to a man, they all agreed. They would land in the Pas-de-Calais. That's the narrowest hop from Britain across the Channel to Europe. And it's also then the quickest route into Germany. So when the Allies did land at Normandy, it admittedly took the Germans a few days to figure out what was happening. Well, this can't be the real landing. This must be a deception or a diversion to get us to jump. And then the real landing is going to come in the Pas-de-Calais. Remember, the Allies had done deception operations to lead the Germans in that direction. You know, it indicates to me, Bernie, the best deception operations is when your opponent is already leaning that way, and then you can really kind of cement it in his mind. So it took the Germans a while to react. Rommel, who is in overall charge of the land forces in Normandy, he's not even there. He's home, giving his wife a present for her birthday. Famously, the staff also didn't want to wake Hitler up, because that's probably not the real thing. If we wake up the Fuhrer, he always gets up in a foul temper. The guy had changed his nights and days. He wasn't going to bed till 3, 4 in the morning, and we wake him up after a couple of hours sleep. There could be trouble.
Now, 80 years later, can you put D-Day in perspective? How did this pivotal event change the world?
Great question. I think I'd identify 2 ways that D-Day changed the world. First of all, it brought an end to the war in Europe within a year. Our troops land in June, and by April, the German army had been destroyed. Hitler kills himself. the war is over in the first week of May. So I think that's the most immediate. But there's a second way, I think, that has to do with America's relationship to the world. So our troops sailed over to Europe in June of 1944, and this time they stayed. I mean, America would remain engaged and involved with the rest of the world, have an active as opposed to a passive foreign policy.
Dr. Rob Citino, senior historian at the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Bernie. Great talk.
Coming up later, how has forecasting changed since World War II? We reveal the surprising similarities and differences. But up next, in our What If segment, we look at what might have happened if Operation Overlord had been executed as originally planned. Stay with us. We're back after the break. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. It's time for our segment, What If? We'll take a look at how the course of history may have changed if Allied troops had invaded Normandy a day earlier. Joining me again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. A lot of interesting thoughts here on D-Day. Let's go. Originally, it was the 5th or the 6th, and there was some disagreement.
4th, 5th, or 6th, yeah.
But there was some disagreement, someone, as we talked about earlier. So what would have happened if the invasion would have went on the 5th instead of the 6th?
Well, the 5th was much stormier, and it's quite possible it would have failed. The weather turned out, even though it wasn't ideal, was much more favorable on the 6th, and obviously the invasion, the landing, was successful, even though thousands of troops were lost, killed, and 10,000 injured. And if it went on the 5th, it may have failed. And if it had failed, Germany would have been strengthened, obviously. They could have focused their efforts to repel the Soviet Union coming in from the east, and American troops and the Allies coming up from Italy, from the south, and the war may have drug on longer, maybe 6 months, a year, or even longer. The Allies would have suffered significant losses. Who knows what it would have done to the leadership of the Allies. They were successful on the 6th, but who knows with the failure on the 5th, what that would have meant. So it would have really changed history quite a bit.
As you talked about earlier, conditions weren't ideal then either.
Well, they're never
better.
Ideal. Yeah, they're never ideal there. And of course, weather forecasting was a lot less reliable in those days. We didn't have forecast models. We didn't have any computer models. It was all based on experience, intuition, pieces of observations here and there. Weather forecasting then was very different.
Yeah. When we look at the invasion, there were only windows of a few days. The next window, from what I understand, was the 18th and 19th of June. So let's say they decided we're going to postpone it. There was a problem on the 18th and 19th, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, the 18th and 19th was the next window, not because of the weather forecast, but because of the tide conditions and the other conditions they needed in order for it to be successful. But as it turned out, as you said, the 18th and 19th of June were very stormy. They would not have been able to do it then, so probably would have drug on into July or later. And again, the war would have gone on for a longer period of time, and the Germans would have had more time to, again, repel the Russians coming in from the east and also fight the Americans coming up from the south. So who knows how much longer the war would have gone on, how many more losses there would have been. So really, that was a very important forecast, and it was the right forecast to go on the 6th of June.
I know you talked about it before, that it wasn't quite ideal. What were the conditions on the 6th? It was good enough, but you said not perfect.
No, it was, the men were seasick, there was waves. I mean, it was not what you and I would like, but, you know, certainly it was rough coming across the channel and landing. You know, the boats are bobble up and down, gunfire, machine gun fire coming from the various enclaves of the German soldiers. But luckily for the Americans, the Panzer Division, Hitler held it back. He didn't allow the Panzer Division to come up and repel the Americans and all the Allies. There was also troops from Poland and Czechoslovakia and Canada and the UK. In fact, the Canadians lost, percentage-wise, many more troops than the Americans. But there were a lot of loss of life, but it would have been much worse on another day. So it was tough. But somehow the Allies overran the German positions, took firm control by the end of the day, despite the great loss of life, and had control of the continent and were able to bring supplies on and more troops on. And that was a real turning point in the war in Europe.
And obviously, if the Germans had the forecast and we lost the element of surprise, it could have turned out a heck of a lot different.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, there was the element of surprise that was really the important part of this,
Well, it had been stormy the 2 days before on the 4th and 5th, and so they didn't think Americans were coming, the Allies were coming on the 6th, so that was important.
Yeah.
And it was cloudy. They also couldn't bomb, they couldn't bomb the Allies as much as they would have liked, and so all this worked. The weather really was, the day they went the 6th was as good as it could have been expected for that area at that general time of year.
And of course, remember, in Europe, things move a lot faster than here in the United States with frequent storms. You often think of June as not a bad month in the United States. Far different in Europe, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, stronger jet stream, faster moving.
Further north.
Further north,
It's further north, people won't think of it, but it's like British Columbia or Washington State, further north.
Yeah, and when we look back at this, it was the forecast that really turned the war. I mean, it was turning, but that was really the final move.
Well, this was key. We didn't have a foothold from that. Yeah, it really was key. It really accelerated the defeat of Germany. And for some reason, Hitler withheld the Panzer divisions because he overruled some of the generals. And the generals themselves didn't think it was coming when it did. So the element of surprise combined with a good enough weather forecast led to that success.
It's just a fascinating story and an unbelievable story. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joe Myers, for joining us today.
My pleasure, Bernie. Enjoyed it.
Up next, we'll share the surprising tools World War II meteorologists had to rely on to make that historic forecast. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. Meteorologists in World War II had far less data to consider and utilize compared to today's meteorologists. Their most important tool was the manual weather observations taken on land and on ships at sea, which were typically updated every 6 or 12 hours, only available at widely separated places. Meteorologists today still have this type of observation, although in many locations, these observations are automated rather than taken manually. Today's network provides much better coverage as they are supplied by many more locations. Plus, they are updated every hour, and when the weather is changing, they are updated as often as every minute. Upper air observations were available in World War II to provide an atmospheric profile every 12 to 24 hours. This data was obtained from weather balloons launched from the ground, ascending more than 15 miles high in the atmosphere, collecting data about temperature, moisture, and wind. Weather balloons are still utilized today, but they are augmented by upper atmospheric data received from modern weather satellites, which provide atmospheric profiles as often as every minute during severe weather, in addition to cloud and other imagery. World War II meteorologists did not have access to weather radar, which today's network of advanced Doppler radars are perhaps the most important tool used by today's meteorologists in forecasting precipitation over the first few hours. Today's meteorologists also benefit substantially from computer-generated forecast guidance, which was not available in the World War II era. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman, Dr. Joe Myers, for joining us today. And a big thanks to all of you for watching. We look forward to seeing you next time.